Hello everyone! Welcome to the briefest possible overview of ancient Greece. Picking up where we left off last time, here we've got a map. We're talking about mostly artwork of the Greek mainland today. So before we begin looking at artwork, let's talk a little bit about what life would have been like in ancient Greece. First, ancient Greece itself was divided into city-states. And each city-state was culturally very different one from the other. You may have heard of Athens versus Sparta. Those are two of the most famous ancient Greek city-states. So geographically and culturally, they were different, but what did they have in common? Well, in every city-state, everyone spoke Greek. Slavery was practiced in every Greek city-state. So when we're looking at the architecture of this region, keep in mind that it was all made with slave power. And only Greek men were considered Greek citizens. So women or foreigners were not considered citizens, and in many cases weren't even really treated like people. They were considered second-rate in every possible respect. We're going to begin by looking at artwork of the classical period in ancient Greece. The classical period began when the Persians were defeated by the Greeks, and up to this point there was many years of warfare in ancient Greece. The Persians were very strong culturally and also in terms of their military power, and they were basically Greeks' #1 rivals, and continue to be for some time. So following this glorious victory against the Persians, Greece, and particularly the Greek city-state of Athens, entered a golden age where art, music, and literature not only flourished, but also grew incredibly. From the classical period, we see a lot of examples of very realistic figurative sculpture. You might remember that with the lecture last time we ended with the sculpture of Critias Boy, the sculpture of a young man standing in contrapposto. Well, that marks the beginning of the classical period, and we see artists building on this fascination with depicting the human form very realistically. When we think of ancient Greek statuary, we usually assume it was made out of marble, but that is often not the case. Most Greek sculptors worked actually in bronze, because with bronze you're able to achieve a much more lightweight effect than with marble. If you think about stone, stone breaks pretty easily, so when carving something out of stone, everything more or less has to connect or have some sort of connecting bridge so that things don't just chip off. With metal, you're able to sculpt things that are much more freestanding and lightweight in some cases, because the bronze statues can be hollow, whereas stone statues have to be completely filled and therefore very heavy. So most classical Greek statues were made in bronze, but bronze during times of warfare or hard times was melted down and then used to make weapons or resold, so a lot of the sculptures have been lost. These sculptures that are referred to as the Artemisian bronzes, because of where they were found, were actually being transported on a ship at sea during ancient times, and the ship was shipwrecked, and these statues were buried for centuries and centuries until they were found by a scuba diver. So these are some of the few examples of actual classical statues that we have still in existence. And when you look at this statue, you can see that the foot here is lifting off of the ground, and that the artist who created this was fascinated with the musculature and with rendering the body as realistically as possible. There would have been inlaid eyes, too, that were made out of ivory and stone, so that this would have looked very realistic. How do you make a metal statue? Well, typically, an artist begins by sculpting the statue in something soft, often wax or clay, and then making a mold of it from plaster, filling the mold with wax and making sure that the wax coats every part of the mold, then breaking it up and surrounding it by concrete. This is the simplest possible form of this, by the way. There's much more to it that I can't get into, but it's really cool. I encourage you to look it up. Then applying fire so that all of the wax is burned out, and replacing the wax area with molten bronze. So this is melted metal, or whatever metal is being used to cast the object. Using this method, you're able to potentially make more than one cast of the sculpture. And you can see that this here has been filled in so that the entire sculpture doesn't have to be made out of metal, it can be hollow. Which means that although we associate metal with being very heavy, these sculptures are actually relatively light, and because of this they can look very lifelike. So you can see that that sculpture that we looked at just 2 slides ago was stepping only on one foot. Its right foot is supported only by the toes. But again, many of those bronzes have been lost, so a lot of the statues that we have from this time period are actually copies that were made by Roman artists. The Roman artists were able to see the original Greek bronze statues because at the time they weren't yet melted down, and they made many copies of it because they were huge fans of ancient Greek artwork. Here is another very famous ancient Greek statue. Like Critias Boy, it's considered to be a statue that was copied and emulated and studied by artists for generations after its creation. It's called Doryphoros, which in Greek means spear thrower, because he would have been holding a spear. And in many cases we know the names of the artists, so Polykleitos is the name of the guy who created this statue, and he did some writing about it. He said that he was trying to create a statue that had both stillness and movement, that showed strength and repose. He wanted to combine everything, so he used that same contrapposto stance where most of the weight is on one foot, and because of this stance there's a slight twist in the whole body, which takes a lot of artistic mastery to show in a sculpture. Let's talk a little bit about architecture. This is the Acropolis of Athens, and Athens, like today, it still is one of the largest and most important cities in Greece. This is a reconstruction of what the Acropolis would have looked like when it was first built, and the Acropolis was a palace complex on the top of the highest part of the city. The people of Athens worshipped the goddess Athena. She was the patron goddess of the city of Athens. And Athena, the ancient Greek goddess, is a goddess of wisdom, but also of warfare. The largest structure on the Acropolis is the temple to the goddess Athena, which is called the Parthenon. The Parthenon today is in relatively poor shape. It's been through a lot, but there are a lot of writings and reconstructions of what it would have looked like when it was first built. The Parthenon is very notable because it was considered to be a mathematically perfect temple. It appears quite simple and straightforward, but that's actually because of all of the very subtle and fine tweaking that went into creating it. These columns appear to be perfectly spaced apart, but if you come to think of it, if they were actually mathematically the same distance apart, they would, in perspective, appear to get sort of crunched as they got closer to the edges, just because of the way our eyes perceive distance and space. So the architects who created the plans for the temple, they carefully calculated how far away the columns would have to be so that they always appear to be in perfect symmetry with one another. The same is true of the ground floor of the temple. Instead of being completely flat, it's slightly curved, so that when seen in perspective, it appears more flat, super flat, than if it were actually flat. In other words, everything about this has been tweaked so that it's super. Everything about it is extra. It's more straight. It's more balanced. It's more symmetrical than anything that was actually quote unquote balanced or symmetrical. This is the epitome of the Greek search for perfection that we see in all of their art and architecture. I've included here a floor plan of what the Parthenon would have looked like when it was before it was partially destroyed. And inside of it would have been a temple area that contained a statue of Athena. And this statue has long since been lost, but it was supposed to be absolutely incredible, semi-divine. It was made of gold and ivory and marble, and was probably looted sometime in the ancient world because it was so valuable. It was also really big. Here we have some little figurines of people, just so you can imagine the scale of the statue itself. It's incredibly detailed. You can't quite see it in this rendering, but even on this platform part of her sandals, there are small details of the Greeks in glorious battle. Moving forward, this here is the Aphrodite of Knidos, and this is one of the first representations we have of a goddess in the nude. So if we were to look at other early representations of Greek gods, most of them would have been male, most of them would have been nude. If they were a female goddess, they would have been represented just like Athena is here, fully clothed. But here for the first time we see Aphrodite, and she's emerging from the bath. So she has her bathrobe there in her left hand, and she's covering herself, which suggests a kind of psychology, and it humanizes the goddess. She's caught in a very relatable moment. I imagine if I were in her position, I'd try and cover myself or do something similar. So we see a step towards not only trying to render a physically perfect human form, but also trying to capture something of human experience and emotion in sculpture, even in this case in the sculpture of a god. Moving forward to the Hellenistic period. In the Hellenistic period, we're going to see a shift towards making artwork that is even more emotional, even more relatable and dramatic. The Hellenistic period is marked by Alexander the Great's conquest of all of what was to him the known ancient world. And thanks to his conquest, the Greek Empire was extended exponentially and was huge. It was the biggest empire that the world had known to date, and as a result, the Greek culture became sort of the moving global force of the Western world. Here I've got a little portrait of Alexander the Great, and after his conquests, the empire itself began to kind of split, but Greek culture was a unifying factor. How big did he make the empire exactly? Here on the top we have a map of what ancient Greece was before Alexander the Great, and here is how far he was able to extend the empire. Huge, absolutely unheard of until that point. This is one of the better known examples of a portrait sculpture of Alexander the Great. However, all of these portraits were done after Alexander's death, and very little of any information that might tell us something concrete about Alexander survives. Keep in mind that Alexander the Great died when he was only 33 years old. I like this timeline because it reminds us of how brief his life was and also how extraordinary. He was born in Macedonia, and Aristotle, a Greek philosopher you might have heard of, was rumored to be his tutor. There's a very famous incident where Alexander the Great is said to have tamed his horse, Bucephalus, who stayed with him until they both died. Bucephalus was supposed to be absolutely enormous and wild and a sort of a vicious black horse. But again, all of this is semi-mythological because very little is known about Alexander the Great in actuality. And we can see all of his glorious victories until he died in Babylon, potentially of alcohol poisoning, but even that is not really known. He was able to complete his conquest because under Alexander the Great, the Greek army devised a new form of warfare in which they used long spears and shields to create this semi-impenetrable line of defense against their enemies. So it was due to this technology that they were able to conquer so much of the world so effectively. And it is said that Alexander the Great said this: "I'm not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I'm afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion," which I think is very insightful. And just a little bit more about Alexander the Great's lasting influence. We see his image used on coins and then referenced throughout art. So here's a Roman statue from some centuries later, a French painting, and then of course Napoleon, who was obsessed with Alexander the Great and dreamed of being him. This is one of the most famous depictions of Alexander. This is Alexander the Great, and here he is, the Battle of Issus, which was a decisive victory for the Greeks against the Persians, the constant enemies of ancient Greece. And here Alexander is locked in some really intense eye contact with Darius III, the leader of the Persian army, and Alexander is advancing. So this is kind of the turning point of the battle where it becomes clear that Greece will win. This is a copy of an ancient Greek mosaic which is now lost, and there are several Roman copies that exist. I include this image because it's quite famous and you'll probably see it elsewhere. This is the statue of the goddess Nike, who is the goddess of victory, from a Greek temple. It is now in fairly bad disrepair, but here is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like. And you can see in it a new fascination with movement and an attention to the details of the drapery, and there's a real sense of life and action in it that was unknown in the earlier statues that we've seen. What's interesting about this quote-unquote more modern Greek statuary is that it becomes less allegorical and less divine and more interested or entrenched in the natural and day-to-day world. This is one of my favorite Greek statues, a statue of an old market woman, because it's literally just that, the statue of a woman who's been struggling probably for quite a while. She's bringing her wares to market, and you get a real sense of action and of suffering and of her physical existence in the world. It feels so real, and it's so dramatic, and so much attention has been paid to the emotional details of the piece that it feels even more real than real, and so very relatable. And then finally we're going to end with this here. This is a statue of Laocoon and his sons. This statue was actually said to be discovered by an Italian farmer who was digging up his field, and he found this underneath his farm. It was purchased by the Vatican, and it can be seen in Vatican City. And this sculpture is said to be the earliest perfect representation of human suffering. I've included some little close-ups of the faces. This here is Laocoon himself, and here's one of his sons, and you can see they're really having a really bad time here. What's the story? This is a episode from Greek mythology, and the story itself kind of changes based on who you ask. Maybe Laocoon, this central figure, was being punished by the gods for having sex with his wife in a temple, or perhaps it was because he didn't listen to the warnings saying that the giant wooden horse brought by the Greeks was going to destroy the Trojans. This is an episode from the Iliad that you might be familiar with. Whatever the case, the gods curse him by sending a snake. And he, in some cases, the snake kills him and both of his sons. In other cases, it only kills his 2 sons. But here it is, all of them struggling with the snake. Whatever the Greek mythological story is, you can kind of set that aside. What I want you to focus on is the intensity and the clarity with which human physical pain is depicted. This is the first time we've seen this kind of drama and theatricality, especially on this scale in sculpture. And look at the lavish attention that's paid to all of the details. Look at the drapery, look at the way that his son's skin folds in as he bends over to try and take away this snake. And the snake's strength itself is fairly unrivaled by anything that we've seen before. And there we have it.